What if everything you thought you knew about the most famous tragedy in modern royal history was suddenly dragged into the harsh light of a courtroom? Not a documentary, not a news report, but a chilling what if that refuses to let your mind rest. Imagine waking up to headlines so explosive they feel illegal to read. Imagine social media freezing, television anchors struggling to breathe, and a single question echoing across the world like a gunshot in a cathedral. What if Queen Camilla stood accused in a fictional trial for the death of Princess Diana? Before you react, pause. This is not history. This is not an allegation. This is an alternate reality, a thought experiment, a mirror held up to grief, suspicion, power, and the stories we never stop telling ourselves. And here's the unsettling part. Millions would believe it, because some stories never truly end. They just wait, waiting for the right moment, the right fear, the right fracture in public trust. Let me ask you something directly. Why, more than 2 decades later, does the name Diana still stop conversations cold? Why does her image still feel unfinished, unresolved, almost interrupted? We've been told the story is over, investigated, closed, filed away, and yet, every few years, it rises again. In documentaries, in whispers, in comment sections, in late-night conversations where someone always says, "But what if?" That "what if" is where this story begins. Not with an accusation, but with a question so dangerous it was never supposed to be asked. What if justice, real or imagined, finally came for the crown? Picture this fictional world. A Britain already on edge. Institutions questioned. Authority eroding. Faith in official narratives thinning like worn paper. Into that fragile moment drops a single spark. A hypothetical reopening of the Diana case, framed not as history, but as accountability. In this imagined timeline, it isn't evidence that explodes first. It's emotion. Old wounds reopen overnight. Flowers appear again at palace gates. Photographs of Diana flood timelines like ghosts demanding attention. People who weren't even alive when she died suddenly feel personally betrayed. Why? Because Diana was never just a person. She became a symbol. The people's princess. The woman who smiled while suffering. The outsider trapped inside a golden cage. And symbols don't die quietly. Now contrast that with the other figure in this fictional drama. Camilla. To be clear, in reality, she is a living person with a documented public life. But in public imagination, she occupies something far more volatile. A role in a story people emotionally wrote long before facts ever mattered. In this alternate reality, she is not a queen consort. She is a symbol too. Of replacement. Of betrayal. Of the life Diana didn't get to finish. And when symbols collide, logic becomes optional. That's why this fictional trial grips the world so tightly. Not because of proof, not because of truth, but because it feels emotionally inevitable to people who never let go of their grief. Let's slow this down. This story doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in memory. Memory is dangerous. Memory edits. Memory selects. Memory exaggerates. And when memory mixes with pain, it doesn't care about timelines or facts. It cares about meaning. Ask yourself honestly. How many people already feel, deep down, that Diana was wronged by the system around her? Now ask the next, more uncomfortable question. If a system wronged her emotionally, how easy is it to imagine it wronged her in darker ways? That leap, that emotional shortcut, is the foundation of this fictional world. In this imagined Britain, a symbolic inquiry is announced, framed not as criminal, but as historical accountability. Harmless words, academic words, safe words, until they aren't. Because the moment names are mentioned, everything changes. The moment Camilla's name enters the narrative, not as a defendant yet, but as a presence, the story ignites. News panels split in two. Commentators argue not about evidence, but about morality. Social media becomes a courtroom without rules. And here's the contradiction that fuels the fire. No one can point to a single definitive act, but everyone feels certain anyway. How does that happen? Because certainty doesn't always come from facts. Sometimes it comes from repetition. From decades of storytelling where one woman was framed as the tragic heroine and another as the obstacle. This fictional trial feeds on that imbalance. And in this imagined reality, the crown hesitates. Silence is chosen. No immediate denial. No dramatic defense. Just a pause. That pause is fatal. Because silence, in the age of outrage, sounds like guilt. Now let's talk about why this story matters now. Not historically, but culturally. We live in an era where institutions are no longer trusted by default, where people believe official versions only until a better story appears, where emotion often beats verification. In that environment, a fictional trial like this becomes believable not because it's true, but because it feels emotionally consistent. And consistency is powerful. People don't ask, "Is this real?" They ask, "Does this make sense with what I already believe?" That's the trap. This imagined case doesn't rely on new evidence. It relies on old feelings. Every clip of Diana looking lonely, every quote about unhappiness, every memory of her saying she felt trapped. Those moments are repurposed, reinterpreted, weaponized. And Camilla, fairly or unfairly, becomes the focal point. Not because she caused Diana's death in reality, but because in public imagination, she represents the life Diana lost. That's the emotional substitution that drives the entire narrative. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. In this fictional world, people begin demanding consequences not for actions, but for symbolism. They want a reckoning. They want someone to carry the weight of unresolved grief. They want an ending that history never gave them. Justice becomes theater, and theater demands a villain. This is how the idea of a sentence, an impossible, symbolic sentence, is born long before any fictional verdict exists. A punishment not meant to rehabilitate, not meant to correct, but meant to satisfy a collective emotional hunger. 105 years. A number so absurd it stops being legal and becomes mythic. A sentence designed not to punish a person, but to bury a story. But here's the twist most people miss. In this fictional world, the trial doesn't expose Camilla. It exposes us. Our need for clean endings. Our discomfort with ambiguity. Our willingness to rewrite reality if it makes pain easier to live with. And that's why the story is dangerous. Because once you accept justice without evidence in fiction, it becomes easier to accept it in reality. Now, stay with me, because we're just getting started. In the next section, everything shifts. Because in this alternate timeline, the past doesn't just resurface emotionally. A single fictional document emerges. And the moment it does, the world stops asking what if, and starts asking how deep does this go? The headlines didn't ease their way in. They detonated. At exactly 6:17 a.m. London time, phones across the country lit up with notifications so alarming that many people assumed they were hoaxes. Screens refreshed. Apps crashed. Newsrooms scrambled. And somewhere between disbelief and déjà vu, one phrase began trending faster than anything seen before. Diana inquiry reopened. Not reopened as a criminal investigation. Not reopened as a trial. Reopened as a review of accountability. A harmless phrase on paper. A seismic event in reality. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt the past physically grab the present by the throat? This was one of those moments. Within minutes, breakfast television abandoned its planned segments. No weather. No cooking demos. Just anchors staring straight into cameras, carefully choosing words like they were defusing explosives. They kept repeating the same disclaimer. This is fictional. This is hypothetical. This is a historical exercise. But the tone betrayed them, because everyone knew what this really was. A reopening of the one story that never stayed closed. By 6:30 a.m., floral images of Kensington Palace from 1997 were circulating again. Grainy footage. Candlelit vigils. Faces streaked with tears. Young people seeing it for the first time. Older viewers feeling it all over again. Grief doesn't age. It just waits. And here's the contradiction that made the moment so volatile. Nothing new had actually happened yet. No charges. No names formally mentioned. No evidence revealed. And still, the world reacted as if a verdict had already been announced. Why? Because the idea alone was enough. In this fictional Britain, the announcement came from a newly formed parliamentary committee focused on what they called historical moral responsibility. A vague mandate. Intentionally vague. That vagueness was the spark. Commentators argued immediately. Some said it was overdue. Others called it reckless. A few tried to shut it down entirely. But the committee chair said something that made everything worse. This is not about rewriting history. It is about understanding it fully. Fully. That word hung in the air like a threat. Understanding implies gaps. Gaps imply secrets. Secrets imply lies. And once lies are implied, trust collapses. By mid-morning, speculation exploded. Was this about the paparazzi? Was this about security failures? Was this about media pressure? And then someone asked the question no one was supposed to ask. Would members of the royal family be named? Silence. That silence lasted just long enough to feel intentional. Now here's where the story turns. Because in this imagined timeline, the public didn't wait for answers. They filled in the blanks themselves. Names began trending. Some expected, some shocking. But one name kept resurfacing again and again, pulling the conversation into dangerous territory. Camilla. At first, it was subtle. A few posts, a few speculative comments framed as questions. Does anyone remember how quickly things changed after Diana? Has accountability ever applied equally in that family? I'm not saying anything. I'm just asking questions. Questions are powerful when they carry accusations in disguise. By noon, those questions had turned into narratives. Narratives turned into assumptions. Assumptions hardened into beliefs. And beliefs don't need proof to spread. Let's pause here, because this moment matters. In this fictional world, Camilla had not been accused of anything. Not legally, not formally, not even hypothetically by the committee. But public imagination had already put her on trial. Why her? Because stories need contrast. Diana is light. Camilla is shadow. It's not fair. It's not factual. But it's emotionally convenient. And convenience drives outrage. Television panels began inviting psychologists instead of legal experts. They talked about symbolism, about unresolved grief, about how societies sometimes demand accountability not to punish the guilty, but to soothe themselves. One analyst said something chilling. When a tragedy lacks a villain, people invent one. That clip went viral because it felt true. But then something happened that shifted the entire tone from emotional to ominous. At 2:43 p.m., a fictional internal memo was leaked. Not confirmed, not authenticated, but devastating. It allegedly referenced previously undisclosed considerations related to Diana's death. The language was dry, bureaucratic, almost boring, which made it terrifying. Because bureaucratic language is where secrets hide best. The memo didn't name Camilla, but it mentioned individuals whose proximity to the emotional dynamics of the principal figures warrants examination. That sentence alone spawned 1,000 interpretations, and every interpretation pointed in the same direction. Social media erupted. Protest hashtags formed within hours. Candle emojis mixed with broken heart symbols and crown icons split down the middle. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered. Then a larger one. Then cameras arrived. No chance yet. Just presence. Presence is a warning. Inside the palace, in this fictional narrative, advisors urged calm. They emphasized the hypothetical nature of the inquiry. They reminded everyone that this was not a trial. But they underestimated one thing. The public didn't want hypotheticals. They wanted answers. And if answers weren't coming, they would create them. By evening, the first fictional op-ed appeared. The headline was careful, almost polite. Why accountability shouldn't be afraid of names. The article didn't accuse. It insinuated. It framed Camilla as a figure who benefited from Diana's absence without ever suggesting she caused it. But implication is enough. Because once benefit is established, suspicion follows. The article asked another dangerous question. If a system protects its own, how do we ever know where responsibility truly lies? That question spread faster than the article itself. And now the narrative had shifted. This was no longer about Diana's death. It was about power. About who answers when tragedy intersects with privilege. About whether the monarchy exists above moral scrutiny. That's when the word trial entered the conversation for the first time. Not from officials, from the public. A fictional idea floated online, a symbolic trial, a moral trial, a court of history. People debated it as if it were reasonable. And once something feels reasonable, it feels inevitable. News anchors tried to slow the momentum. They reminded viewers this was an alternate history exercise, a thought experiment. But their warnings sounded defensive. And defensiveness suggests fear. Then came the moment that locked the story into place. At 9:12 p.m., a spokesperson for the committee was asked directly whether any member of the royal family could be called to testify in this fictional inquiry. The answer was just one sentence. No one is categorically excluded. That was it. No accusation. No confirmation. Just possibility. But possibility is gasoline. Overnight, international outlets picked up the story. American panels framed it as a reckoning. European commentators framed it as a crisis. Online creators framed it as confirmation of everything they'd suspected for years. And somewhere in the chaos, the core truth was lost. This was still fictional, still hypothetical, still unresolved. But emotion doesn't wait for resolution. Emotion demands movement. By the time midnight passed, public opinion had already begun to divide into camps. Those who wanted closure at any cost, and those who feared what reopening the past would destroy. No one realized yet that this was only the beginning.